Hello, welcome to Aston Originals. Today we're talking to Dr. Dan Shaw and Dr. Charlotte Pennington about their research into social media and the styles of interaction within it. Thank you for joining us in the studio today, both of you. If this is your first time, how nervous are you?
Scale of 1 to 10?
Scale of 1 to 10.
I'd give it a firm 8.
Charlotte?
I'm going to go 9.
Now, what I'll do is the easy bit, which you shouldn't get wrong, and that's ask you for your name and what you do. So, Dan, I'll start with you, if that's all right.
So, okay. What do I do? So I am a experimental psychologist by trade, like our students here at psychology. I'm training to understand the science behind psychology as a discipline. For whatever reason, I ventured into the world of brain imaging because I'm interested in general in how we interact with one another as humans. And so understanding how the brain allows us to do that is particularly interesting to me. But by trade, an experimental psychologist.
Charlotte will give him a 9 out of 10 for that. Pretty good. So, just want to do the same.
So I'm Charlotte, and I, as well as Dan, am an experimental psychologist, but I would call myself an experimental social psychologist. So I look at a term called social cognition, mainly, thinking, again, like Dan, about how we interact with other people, but from a more behavioural point of view. So Dan's looking at the brain mechanisms, but I'm looking at how we behave, typically in real-world social interactions and situations. And currently we've expanded that into the world of social media because the kind of pressing question is, how social is social media? Does it really mimic these real-world interactions that we have with other people?
Very interesting. Dan, just tell us firstly what you set out to do in this research.
Right. A very brief summary of what we know already, because that then leads on to why we did what we did. So social media, unsurprising to everyone, is exploding at a rapid rate. I think the recent statistic is that 4 billion people worldwide engage on social networking sites on a daily basis. That's epic. And that's only going to grow. And psychologists are starting now to ask what impact that might be having on our psychological and mental well-being. And so lots of research has been conducted to investigate what impact social media usage or increasing usage might be having. And what that's shown us is that we should be thinking less about how much time people are spending on social media and more about what it is that they're doing whilst they're on social media. So how do people behave on social networking sites? And very broadly, very crude dichotomy that's been shown is that individuals tend to engage with social media in one of two ways. Again, very crude, but people either engage passively, so they will doom scrolling as an example. They will go through and scroll through other people's feeds without necessarily engaging in it or posting their own material. Or they might be slightly more active. And by that, we mean engaging in other people's material. So liking content, for example, but also sharing our own content. And in doing so, of course, we open ourselves up to comments from other people. So this active-passive dichotomy is fairly well established. And we now know that, or we're beginning to understand more and more, that passive usage might be related to more harm or might have more negative effects on our psychological well-being, as opposed to active usage, which might be more beneficial to our mental and psychological well-being. Presumably, as Charlotte has said, because it's more interactive, it mimics interaction, real life interaction more accurately. So what we did is the way that people typically have looked at online behavior is to ask people with questionnaires, how do you use social media? How do you use social networking sites? How have you used it in the past 24 hours, in the past week, or in the past month? And that's shown us this active-passive dichotomy, and it's been very useful to ask people this information. However, we know as psychologists, after decades of research, that we're not as good as we think we are at introspecting and reporting our behaviors, our behavioral tendency and preferences. And so that subjective route of measuring online behavior perhaps is less effective as perhaps more objective measurements. So actually measuring how people are doing it. But until recently, until we developed this task, objective measurements were lacking. And so what we set out to do was to create an experimental task that could objectively measure how people are engaging in social media, specifically in a mock social networking platform that we created, which we called, unimaginatively, the Social Networking Site Behavior Task.
I think that's work, I think. That.
So SNSBT, what is it? All we did is we did this online. I'll explain that later. But each individual was shown a mock social networking platform. Or they weren't told it was mock, they were told it was a brand new social networking platform and they were going to trial it. And they were told that they were trialing along with 99 other individuals who formed a social network in which this individual was part. And they were presented with images that were supposedly being posted by other members of this 99 or 100-person network, 99 others of this network. And they were presented with the images that were being shared, and they had one of three options every time they saw an image. They had three buttons. One button was next. They could press next and they could just scroll on to the next image. Or they could like the image that they saw, in which case they saw kind of the all too familiar heart-shaped icon, or they could choose to share that image with the rest of the network. And they were told that some of the 99 other people in the network hadn't seen some of the materials that other members had seen. So when they were reposting or sharing materials that they were encountering, other people in the network were seeing it for the first time, and they might then comment on that material. So one of three responses: to scroll through, to engage and like, or to engage and share other people's content. It was a very crude experimental paradigm because, of course, behavior on social networking sites is so complex, multifaceted, nuanced, but we had to break things down into its very bare essentials in order to establish whether or not this task might capture online behavior. So the images were very crude. They were seeing landscape images. There were no faces because that might have presented new experimental confounds if people knew the person in the image or didn't know the person in the image. So it was very basic materials. And the responses that they were receiving when they shared content were just things like, oh, nice image, or, oh, I've been here, if it was a landscape image, or, oh, I want to go there. But still, they believed that those comments were coming back to them from other members of the network. So that was the experimental task.
Charlotte, can you just tell us about some of those findings, some of the trends that came out of it? Good, strong participation, 500, good sample size?
Yeah, so we, like Dan was saying initially, we looked at this online through a crowdsourcing platform, and we had a final sample size of 526 participants, which in experimental research is a really large sample. And this allowed us to kind of delineate into different behaviours, which I'll discuss in a little while. But overall, a really large sample size across the UK and the US, I believe. And again, so this allows us to make quite reliable inferences, I think. And what we wanted to look at for the outcome measures were certain aspects of wellbeing. So perhaps I'll pass back over to Dan and you can discuss some of the measures before we look at the findings.
So we, as a way of validating the task, essentially, we didn't know if we were going to be accurately capturing behavior. We hoped we would, but we didn't know for certain because we were trialing this and we were piloting it. So what we did is we asked people about we asked them to report their online behaviors. And we thought, although they are, we know, suboptimal and not particularly accurate, if we are accurately capturing active usage, then people should, in theory, report that they use social media more actively than people that were performing the task more passively. They should also report that they use it more passively. So we asked them about their self-reported usage. But in order to, as a way of assessing whether different styles of usage captured on this experimental task might be related to individuals' mental well-being, we gave them 4 other questionnaires. The first, we asked them about loneliness, which perhaps is self-explanatory. We asked them how lonely they felt at that particular time point. We also asked them 3 things that are kind of related, but also quite distinct. The first was social connectedness, and that refers to our experience of being connected to or close to a social network, so how we feel connected. The other was a sense of belonging, and that really measures how much we value being part of a social network, but also how we perceive others to value others in that network, to value our membership of it. And the third was social capital, which online social capital, I should stress, which is more about our perceptions of what we take from our belonging to a social network. So, for example, how much emotional support do we feel we get from that social network? So those questionnaires were administered to these individuals that were participating in the experimental task.
It might be worth talking a little bit more as well about that social capital element, because there was 2 separate dimensions within that, and we found slightly different findings depending on which one of those it was. So one of these asked about bridging, and this is about bridging ties through social networks. So you can imagine I might know Dan, so I might have a very personal communication with him, but it also allows me to bridge with other people that I might not have even met in real life, such as you, Sam, for example, before today. So that's more about like the bridging element. It allows us to reach out to other people and have these vast amounts and number of friends and social networks that we might not have in real life. And then the other element of that was bonding. So how much do you tend to bond with those people in that network? So what did we find? So what we did with participants' data is this really clever statistical technique, which is known as cluster analysis. But put simply, what this does is it kind of profiles people into these different groups or clusters based on similar behaviours that they were showing on this task. And extending this active-passive dichotomy that we've seen in the literature to date, we revealed 3 groups, which we name interactive, reactive, and passive. People in the passive group, and there were large numbers in each of this group, but people were more likely to be passive. I think we had about 200 participants that were more likely to be passive. And they were the individuals who were skipping more images, liking a little bit, but not really sharing the content.
Very infrequently, yeah.
Yeah. Then we had reactive that kind of sat in between. And these individuals were, again, scrolling a little bit, but liking more, and then sharing a little bit more than the passive people, but it was more their liking behaviour that we could see coming out. And then lastly, we had these interactive individuals who were liking a lot of content, but then sharing more than the other 2 groups. So we had these really kind of reliable and distinct groups that came out with a nice number of people in each. And the first finding that was really nice to see is that this corresponded to their self-reported online behaviour. So the active-passive dichotomy that they were self-reporting was shown in these 3 different cluster types. But straight away our data extended previous findings by saying it's not as simple as this active-passive divide. Even active usage can be multidimensional. When you like something, that's still relatively one-dimensional because you are liking and nothing is coming back. But with this sharing element, the interactive style, that was a lot more interpersonal. They were seeing other comments. They were having these interactions. So that was really nice to see.
Mm.
And then when we looked at their kind of elements of mental well-being, what we found is that the interactive people reported greater social connectedness and social capital compared to the passive people. But extending this kind of bonding and bridging element that I said about before with social capital, there was also differences between all of the three groups with regards to the bridging part. So interactive were reporting more than passive, reactive more than passive, but also interactive are still reporting more than the reactive people who kind of were in between these two groups. And I think that makes sense when you think about what social media is. It allows us with these bridging networks between different people. So that was really nice to see. But we didn't find any differences in loneliness. And there might be very many reasons around that, including the pandemic, for example. And we didn't see any differences in sense of belonging. But for preliminary data, using this task, we think this is really promising because not only does it validate itself with the self-reports, it does show potentially meaningful differences in social connectedness and social capital. In addition to this, we found that these results were contingent on how many friends that people reported they had. And I think this makes sense because how can you feel socially connected if you have no one to connect to? So the people in the interactive cluster were reporting that they had way more friends on social media than the other people in the other clusters. So again, that gives us certain kind of variables that we really need to think about in the future to control for, to check, and to see what can kind of underpin these potential clusters.
Yeah, and absolutely. And this new task really allows us, perhaps for the first time, to experimentally investigate the impact of these, what appear to be very important variables. Whereas before all we could do was ask people, now we can actually measure their behavior and see how it relates to these various, as I said, multifaceted variables.
Did any of the findings surprise you? Because I suppose as the pandemic skewed it somewhat,
Right.
I imagine.
Yes, that's a massive question. This was administered online precisely because of the pandemic, because of the restrictions imposed on face-to-face testing. We couldn't do this in a typical laboratory, which is what we would have wanted to do ideally. So we were forced to do it online. That actually ended up to be a really good shout because we could reach far more people. They were then performing it on a mobile device sometimes, which is simulates more accurately social media usage perhaps. But of course, when asking people about their current loneliness or about their sense of belonging to social networks during the pandemic, which was an entirely different world that we all know. So asking people about that at that particular time, who knows, and that's yet to be established, whether the same kind of reports of loneliness will be found if we were to replicate the experiment today, for example, where we're starting to re-establish real interpersonal relationships. So a great question, answer unknown, to be answered.
TBC. Where do you take it from here?
Where do we stop taking it?
This is why it's exciting, I think, because there's so many new research directions and this field has exploded and there's so many ideas coming out. One thing that we are very aware of is that we don't know who these people are. And what I mean by that is they might have different personality characteristics as well. You would imagine, for example, that someone who is extroverted might interact and be in this interactive cluster more so than someone who is introverted. And we don't yet have that data. So we have this lovely preliminary data, but now we need to ask the question about who these people are. And is it kind of contingent upon how they act in their social worlds as well? There might be demographic variables that come into play, such as we know from the research that there might be sex differences in social media styles. For example, there's some data that suggests that females are more likely to use it passively, I think. So again, kind of pulling this apart. It's important to say that we actually hold that data in our big data set that we have, But because we didn't set out to look at that, we didn't, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we can't now start picking this apart in a more exploratory fashion to see what's happening. So I think they're my two main ideas coming from this.
And just like the end user, I think to address the elephant in the room, this is correlational. This preliminary study is correlational. And so what we're saying is that people with different styles of usage at that particular time are reporting different psychosocial variables. What we don't know is that how those people feel, how their psychological well-being is influencing their usage, or if their usage is influencing their psychological well-being. So the next step is to ask, how causal is that relationship? Is it one way or the other? And of course, this task allows us to do that. So that's the next obvious step, I think.
Yeah. So our future directions are to kind of use a before and after type style where someone might engage with these platforms, let's say, in our lab, which would be quite immediate, but let's say over the next week, and to see whether actually engaging more interactively has these positive benefits compared to being passive. I think that's really important to have these before and after measurements, because as Dan says, at the moment, we just don't know which is causing which kind of thing. It is correlational. But I think we're excited as experimental psychologists because we've designed this task that mimics social networking platforms. And there is so much we can do with it now. We can personalize it. We can mimic certain social situations in it. We might want to look at the valence of the messaging. So if these are positive messages or negative messages.
So true.
We might want to look at different kind of news feeds and even what's going on in the world, and just kind of momentarily look at differences in well-being as this kind of state variable as well that might fluctuate. Let's say someone might be interactive because they're in a happy mood today, but tomorrow they might be passive because they feel a little bit more down. We're just not sure. So I think that's what's exciting for us, is that the literature has exploded, but kind of our ideas have exploded at the same time.
Do you know what category you each fall into? Have you done it? I don't think I'd not be able to.
And precisely because you can't, this is the beginning of a very long story. You probably can't, because we don't use it in one fixed way all the time. It depends where we are, what platform we're using, how we feel at that time. I think I have to say, if I were forced, which I feel like I am being, I think I would have.
Let's make it fair. Let's do each other. Charlotte, what do you think Dan is, and Dan?
I might.
Charlotte.
Yeah, so I think I could guess Dan's. And it's funny, isn't it? Because the way that you'd be on social media is very different from the way that you'd be in an employment setting. So that's interesting to me. But I would say that you're more of a passive person. You would like to watch videos. You would like to see what's going on and stay in the know. But you don't broadcast yourself. You don't necessarily post content, or you might give updates or things like that.
I would agree with that entirely.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. What would you think?
I would say you were completely, if I just follow your Twitter feed, I would say that you are completely the opposite, and that you enjoy sharing ideas. And I know that you use Twitter more than other platforms because you take more information from it, but I know you're also very good at sharing that information.
Yeah, and I think what Dan's getting at is key here. It might depend on the platform. For example, I use Twitter for work-based pursuits. So I'm very kind of, and because I love that so much, I am broadcasting that information. And I think maybe for me, so I would say I'm reactive, really. For example, on Instagram, I like liking and I like being influenced by other things. But I think less so now do I post a lot of content. And this makes me think of lots of things as well, such as my age. Maybe my age is correlational with that as well. Definitely my mood. So if I'm really happy, I want to show everyone what's going on. If I'm having a really bad and stressful time at work, then I'm not going to really share it with people, which again is really interesting. And I could go off on a tangent with that. I think what's interesting is how we see other people as well is different to how we see ourselves, which gets back at that limitations with questionnaires perhaps as well. So we've come full cycle.
Really interesting stuff. I mean, where can people go to find out more and sort of keep an eye on this journey that you are on?
Good question. Well, the original study is now published. It can be accessed. It's freely available online through a journal called PLOS ONE. We've also written a very short synopsis, understandable for everyone, which is in the conversation. And I'm sure that there will be many other outputs in those two domains very shortly. Fingers crossed.
I would follow up with that and say, if people are interested in following this work, check our website. So we've got Aston profiles, and if you're interested, you'll see our publications as they come out. And we are trying to pursue funding for this stream of research. So
that's it. Give me the money.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and occasionally it's contingent on that as well. But again, our project students as well love this because it's so it's global, isn't it? And it's very, very popular and it's very exciting. So we're doing a few. We've got some planned projects as well with our students in Aston. So again, just keep an eye out, and hopefully we'll come back with updates.
Excellent. Well, we'll keep you in the loop. Thank you for joining us today. Make sure you do subscribe to the YouTube channel. I don't know what it says about you if you do. Or you can follow us on Twitter as well at Aston Originals. But otherwise, thank you to Dan and Charlotte for joining us today.
Welcome. More than welcome.